18 or 22 slot brackets for a better torque control. Now, 18 brackets and 22 slot brackets, they've been around since ages. They've always been around as either being 18 or 22. The thing is, why? Why have they've been around for so long? What's the history of these brackets? So let's explore that. The history is that in 1920, there used to be 22 slot brackets. These were the ones that were advocated by Angle, and that was because he used gold wires. And for the gold wires, they needed the slot to be quite large because of the softness of gold. Gold was quite soft and it wasn't that hard, so they needed a very large cross-section of the wire. In the 1940s, stainless steel came out and they started to make the wires out of stainless steel. Now they don't need the wire to be, they don't need the strength of the wire because the wire is already strong as it is. So what they did until 1955, they realized that when you use a full engagement 22 slot wire, what's going to happen is that what you get is that you have a lot of force and a huge amount of force. And this was not acceptable to have so much force. So what they did is that they started to use 18 slots because 18 slot brackets, they're much better when you're using 18 slot stainless steel wires. Then in the 1980s, the night-eye wires came out. And when you had night-eye wires, and the night-eye wires, they're so much softer. So that nowadays what you needed is that you needed to have less amount of force. You needed to have bigger wires, which provide less force. So they went back to 22 because these night-eye wires, if you use them just for 16 and 14 size, they're so weak. You needed to have full engagement 22 and 21 and 19 wires. So they went back to 22 slot. And that's the history of it. So in the end, it comes down to either being a 22 slot bracket or an 18 slot bracket. But what's the difference between these two slots? Is it just this small 0.1 millimeter? This is 0.55 millimeter and this is 0.45 millimeter? No, that's not the story. The story is more about the wires that engage them, because this wire is an 1825 wire. This is the biggest that will go into an 18 slot bracket, whereas this wire is a 22 slot bracket and a 22 by 28, because this one's even deeper and it's also higher. So you've got a huge wire here versus this wire. You've got quite a lot of strength in this wire more than this wire. So this is the point why we use 22 slot brackets. But if you were to use a smaller wire like this one, an 1825 slot wire like this one, then it doesn't make that much difference. The amount of force being exerted on this 22 slot wire, on the 22 slot bracket, is going to be considerably similar to these wires. But you have a lot of play where the wires, the teeth can slide, and you have less torque control rather than this one. So let's explore that more in depth. Regarding the tip of the wire, if you're going to use a 1622 or an 1825 wire, or if it's an 18 slot or it's a 22 slot, no matter what you do, the amount of tip that the bracket will tip and then engage the wire is from 1 to 2 degrees. So it's actually, there is no difference between a 22 slot or an 18 slot regarding tip control. However, in clinical practice, when you're leveling, if you're leveling a tooth and you want this canine, just the root to go distally and the crown to go mesially, then you'll have two options. If you're using a 22 slot bracket that allows the play probably you'll get more of the crown moving mesially, sliding along the wire. But if you want to use an 18 slot bracket, then probably you'll get more engagement of the bracket with the wire, so that you'll not get the the crown moving mesially, you'll get more root moving distally. But it's not as glamorous as it may seem. The wire, once it binds to the canine, it's going to pull the whole segment forward. So it's difficult to say, is it useful to use 22? Is it useful to use 18? Just depends on the case. Another scenario is when you have mesially tipped central incisors and you're leveling them out. If you use a partially engaged wire, use 22 slot brackets, then you're going to get less friction. There'll be a higher chance for the diastema to open and for the brackets to slide along the wire. But if you're using a more full engaged wire, let's say an 18 slot night tie, 18 slot and 18 night tie wire, then probably you'll get binding here and you'll get more root movement. Of course, you can say I can use the 22 slot bracket and just ligate the centrals and just control the opening of the diastema. Of course, you're right, but I'm just trying to make you think about the concept. On the other hand, when you're trying to level these teeth, if you level them with a thin wire or an 18 slot, 22 slot bracket with a thin wire, then as these teeth, they align, they're going to close the diastema. On the other hand, if you use a full engaged wire on an 18 slot bracket, then probably you'll get more root movement away rather than the favorable closure of the diastema. So this is what you should think about. What about when I'm doing space closure? As you're trying to close the space, what happens is that you get this roller coaster effect. And this roller coaster effect in some degree is because of the heavier forces and the thin wires that were used in the 18 slot brackets. But if you're going to use 22 slot brackets and you're going to retract in mass, then this thick wire that you're going to use, which is no less than 1925 stainless steel, is going to control the roller coaster effect to some degree because of the thicker wires. But if you're a fan of 18 slot brackets, then 18 slot brackets are not that good with in-mass retraction, the sliding way. But you can use loops on the other hand. These loops work much better with the 18 slot brackets, because when you put the 18 slot brackets, you engage the anterior teeth and control their torque, as well as you can use, let's say, a 1725 stainless steel wire, or probably a 1622 stainless steel wire to make the loops, which make them quite resilient. They're quite soft. They can be adjusted. And at the same time, they can control the anterior torque. If you use a 22 slot bracket and use heavy gauge wires, then you're going to get so much force in the loops that you cannot have them with adequate range. And this works the same, whether you retract the whole en masse or you retract the canine first and then retract the anterior teeth. Still here, the 18 slot brackets are of advantage. So in summary, the 22 slot brackets allow the use of heavier wires that bend less, or smaller wires for less force and more play. And 18 slot brackets allow the use of loops with smaller wires with adequate engagement and torque control. What about torque? For torque is a value of the amount of force on either side and the distance between the wires of engagement, the points of engagement of the wire. So having said that, if you have an 18 slot bracket or a 22 slot bracket, in a 22 slot bracket, you have a longer distance. And at the same time, you have a larger wire which is engaged, so you have more force. So in a 22 slot bracket, you have more force and more length of the arm. And this would mean that actually you're going to get more torque control. But is that really the case? Not really. It just depends on the wire you use. If you're a 1622 type of wire person, then using an 18 slot bracket will give you less play than the amount of play you get with a 22 slot bracket. If you're an 18-25 slot type, you still get the same. But if you're a full engagement type of person, you're going to get the full engagement wire, then probably a 22 bracket will be the best one. But most of us have a wire in mind, which they use most commonly. And hence, sometimes 18 slot brackets, they just prefer, they get more engagement and more torque control. So for 18 slot brackets, full engagement is easier because you just put a 1725, 1825 wire, it engages the bracket. And this is good for torque control with stainless steel wires. But 22 brackets, they allow larger and stiffer wires because they're bigger. So they can do torque control even with night tie wires like martensitic night tie wires. And for the 18 ones, they provide more friction with large wires. And this may be an indication for non-extraction cases where you don't need that much sliding, or with loops. And while here, you're going to have less friction with large wires. So it's better with extraction cases than the other side. The second topic I'd like to talk about is bidimensional technique. And the bidimensional technique is when you realize that, especially when you want to do two-step retraction, you want to retract the canine first and then the incisors, then you see that you need to decrease the force, the friction here on the canines, yet you need to increase the anchorage here and here. So you have two different concepts of on the same person. You need less friction, more engagement, and more friction. So how do you get that? Well, you can just change the wires. And this isn't a new idea. It goes back to 1975 and then GNL in 1985. And a lot of people have published a lot of things about the bidimensional technique. And for me, I was very interested in it in the early 2000s. And that was when we only had Roth brackets. And I had a lot of problems with torque control with Roth brackets. So the savior was to use the bidimensional technique. And I've lectured about it in several places. And the whole concept basically is about using 18 slot brackets on the interior teeth. And when you do that, then you're going to control the torque of the interior teeth much better than using 22 slot brackets. Especially keep in mind that at that time you used to use 22 slot bracket, 1622 stainless steel wires. And 1622 stainless steel has a lot of play in 22 brackets, but it has less play in 18 brackets. So we had more control over the torque on the incisors. And then the canines are made out of 22 slots. And this provided much better assistance during the sliding phase, even if you used 18 stainless steel wires. They wouldn't bind to them and they would move quite nicely. And then the molars were generally placed at 18 slot brackets, and that was to control the loss of anchorage in the molars and the premolars. Of course, if you're going to use sliding effects and you want to slide the wire through, you may think of placing the molars and the premolars as 22 slot brackets as well. But this fell out of favor, and for myself, I started not to use it anymore. And the reason why is because the higher torque MBT brackets were introduced with stiffer 1925 stainless steel wires. And these made the control of the torque of the interior teeth much easier than it was before. Because before, we always used to end up in treating extraction cases of class 2 division 1 with upright incisors. Now with the higher torque MBT brackets and the use of 1925 stainless steel rather than 1622, this was less of a problem. Also, the use of in-mass retraction, because when you use in-mass retraction, you don't need the less friction to be on the canines. Actually, you need less friction to be in the premolars and the molars as the wire distally moves backwards. So there was no need for the bidimensional technique anymore. Probably you can do all the 6 anterior as 18, but still, if you have high torque brackets of MBT, generally you don't need these. Another reason was the use of TADs. And with the use of TADS, the control of the amount of anchorage loss was also much easier. And this also made it quite difficult, not needed anymore. Another thing, and the last thing, is the use of self-ligating brackets. As these were introduced, I also extensively used them where I needed them. So if I needed to have less friction on the canine so that the canine can move backwards, I would just slip in a self-ligating bracket. Also, the use of premolar tubes. If I needed less friction to be in the premolar region so that I can slide the wire through, then I would just place a premolar tube. So now that I have more tools to work with, I don't need the bidimensional technique anymore. But the third part of the lecture, which is the most important part of the lecture, is the use of customized slots. And what I mean by customized slots is you put brackets of 18 and 22 in a variety of methods and a variety of techniques in which they make differences for every patient. Now, when you look at the torque value of these teeth, you notice that they're not the same. You look at the torque value of the centrals and canines, the centrals and the laterals. These laterals, they're not the same. And we know from the basics of torque control that if you put the same, a lot of us would put the same brackets on all of these teeth and just wait for leveling to happen. And once leveling has happened, they notice that they don't have an adequate result. The torque was not managed. And the reason for that is the huge amount of play between the wires and the brackets, which is no less than 10 degrees, even for a 1925 stainless steel or 1925 wire. And if you're using lower gauge wires like 1622 or 1725, you have a huge amount of play. And this would mean that the end result is not going to be the same. So let's look at this case, for example. This case presented with a proclined left incisor and an almost retroclined right incisor. As we finished the leveling and alignment and we went into 1925 night eye, you would notice that the right incisor is more or less acceptable, but the left incisor is still relatively proclined, although we're 1925 stainless steel at this moment, and still this torque is not being managed and we haven't slipped it right. So some would argue that we can do that. We can use full engagement wires. Let's go for 22, 28 slot stainless steel wires, and they would engage it more. That's true, but it's not going to engage only the centrals. It's going to engage all the other teeth. So any problems that you have with the bracket positioning or the contour of the teeth is going to be exaggerated. And you may, when you're using heavier gauge wires, you may actually increase your problems rather than decrease them. You may use some torquing pliers to put more torque on the left central. That's possible. But with every change of wire, you'll have to do the same torque bends. You may use a torquing spring on one of the teeth, and that's possible, although it takes quite a considerable amount of time, but it is also an option. But I would rather think of changing the slots and making the brackets play for me rather than I just level first and then watch for the problem later on. So let's consider the first case, the class 2 division 2 case. In this case, when you have the central incisors and you look at the central incisors, they're retroclined. The brackets of the central incisor, they tend to procline the teeth. So if I put the brackets, any bracket, it's going to go with the desired movement. And since I want to procline, if I put it at an 18 slot bracket, it's going to actually fully engage in an 1825 wire or a 1725 wire. It's going to enhance the property, the torque property inside the bracket. So if I use an 18 slot bracket, it's going to enhance the good property of torque inside this bracket. So placing these as 18 is beneficial. But what about the lateral incisors? The lateral incisors, they're proclined. Surely if I put an 18 slot bracket and I put a fully engaged wire, it's going to retrocline them a little bit. That's true. It's going to retrocline them just a little bit because these are over-torqued brackets, especially if they're MPT. So if it's going to just a little bit retrocline them, which is not going to be enough. Even better, if you would invert the bracket and give it a negative torque that's substantially different from the torque that's required, and it's going to be about 20 degrees difference, this is going to show a lot of difference more than if you would use the regular, just the same bracket torque. But should we use a 22 slot bracket or an 18 slot inverted brackets? If you needed sliding and you need the wires to slide out, 22 would be better. If you don't need the sliding, but you need more engagement and you need it to be tougher and more effect, then 18 would be better. For this case, I would probably go with a 22 slot bracket because it's not a severe case. What about this case? In this case, it's not severe. What I would go for is just a regular 18 slot bracket on both of these centrals and put an 18 slot night tie, which is fully engaged, and it's going to correct the torque of these teeth. And since the other teeth are 22, they're not going to be affected with the torque control. Another case where you see the premolar cusp is hanging down and these palatal cusps are more elevated. And you have the option. You can use an 18 slot premolar bracket here. And what happens is that this is going to exaggerate the -7 degree torque and push the crown lingually. And that's a good idea. Or you can use this exaggerated lower 5 bracket, which is a 22 slot Roth bracket, a 22 degree 22 slot as well, Roth bracket from the lower 5. And this is going to be a heavily exaggerated amount of torque. And this is going to push this tooth more lingually. And at the same time, it will have an effect on the adjacent teeth and push their crowns more labially. If you wanted a double action, probably you could use also a 22 degree bracket that's inverted. At the same time, use an 18 slot bracket. That's going to give you a double action. Another thing is the canines, which are very important here because the canines, they're either -7 or +7 if they're inverted or -2 if they're Roth. If you needed to exaggerate the effect of the torque, you can use the 18 slot brackets. If you don't need that, then just go with the regular 22 slot brackets since they're going to allow the root to move more freely and hopefully go sliding inside the cancellous bone rather than hitting the cortical plates. What about that case of these proclined lateral incisors, which was, of course, it was a crossbite, and as these were proclined, you can see that these are proclined, and the roots are more apical, and you need to move these teeth outside, move the roots outside. Should you use a 22 slot bracket that's inverted? Why not? That's a good idea. And you can use a 1725 and 1825 or probably even a 1925 wire. And since there's a lot of torque here, it's going to torque the roots labially. But remember that using heavier gauge wires here is also going to affect the neighboring teeth. You're going to get the canines and central roots more lingually. If this is not desired, then probably you can use an 18 slot bracket. And as these 18 slot brackets, they engage with up to 1825 slot, 1825 arch wires, or even 17, or even probably 1625 wires. They're going to affect the neighboring teeth less. So if it's severe, I'd go with an 18 slot bracket. If it's just a mild case like the first one, then a 22 slot bracket will be probably preferable. So the take-home message for today is to choose brackets for teeth and not sets of brackets for dental arches. And thank you for your kind listening.